The millionaire's son, a bright-eyed boy, couldn't even run. His life was a golden cage, surrounded by the best doctors money could buy. But the diagnosis was always the same: severe, chronic, incurable asthma. His father, a man who built an empire, felt powerless watching his son struggle to breathe with the slightest effort. Until a new housekeeper, a woman with a serene smile and calloused hands named Helena, was hired. She didn't bring medicines or equipment, but something everyone had forgotten: an old baseball glove and the belief that joy was the best medicine. What happened next, no doctor could ever explain. The bluish glow of 6 state-of-the-art monitors bathed Arthur's face in a cold, impersonal light. On the main screen, complex charts danced, representing the flow of capital that, with a single click, he had redirected, sealing a deal that would add another 0 to his already incalculable fortune. The soft chime of the electronic confirmation echoed through the silent office, a sanctuary of glass and polished steel overlooking a manicured garden that no one ever set foot on. To the outside world, he was a titan, a man whose touch turned data into gold, whose investments in stocks and crypto were legendary. He was a billionaire, a modern-day Midas, but within these walls, he felt like a beggar. Every contract signed, every spike in his net worth was a slap from reality. He could buy companies, islands, futures, but he couldn't buy the one thing he wanted most in the universe: a single, simple, deep breath of air for his son, Leo. The boy, his only heir, lived like a prince in an ivory tower, a sterilized mansion where every dust particle was hunted and exterminated by an air purification system that had cost more than a small nation's GDP. His severe asthma, a cruel verdict delivered by the greatest specialists money could buy, had turned their home into a gilded cage. Joy, like pollen, was a forbidden allergen. Ever since Helen, his wife, had been taken by a swift and merciless illness, the silence in the mansion had become an ocean where Arthur and Leo were slowly drowning, each on his own island of grief. He had already lost the love of his life. Now, the very air conspired to steal his son. Hope was a luxury his vast capital could no longer afford. It was in this vacuum of despair that she appeared. Arthur first saw her through the cold lenses of his security cameras, a web of electronic eyes that gave him the illusion of control. Her name was Elena, and the file on his tablet described her simply as new cleaning staff. He watched her in the grand foyer, standing beneath the crystal chandelier that was worth more than any house she had likely ever owned. She didn't seem intimidated by the opulence. Her gaze was serene, and there was a dignity in her posture that no amount of wealth could bestow. The head housekeeper, Mrs. Davison, a woman whose rigidity was the backbone of the household, approached her with a general's precision. Her words were sharp, wrapped in an icy politeness, detailing the rules, the protocols, the forbidden zones. Elena listened patiently, her head tilted slightly, her hands clasped in front of a simple floral dress. She was not a threat. She was just an employee, but as Arthur watched her follow the housekeeper down the hall, he noticed something that made him lean closer to the screen. As she passed a vase of white orchids, whose petals were beginning to wilt despite all the botanical care, Elena paused for an instant. Discreetly, she reached out and touched one of the petals with her fingertip, a gesture so subtle and caring it felt like a secret. Mrs. Davison, already several steps ahead, didn't notice, but Arthur saw. He saw the tenderness in a place that knew only efficiency. That night, the image of that touch stayed with him. It was something he hadn't seen in years, an act of selfless care. Weary, he navigated the cameras to the hallway outside Leo's room. And there she was. Elena had finished her shift, but instead of heading for the exit, she was walking slowly down the silent corridor. She stopped in front of the white oak door of his son's bedroom, a place Mrs. Davison had surely declared off-limits to her. Elena didn't try to open it. She just stood there, and then, slowly, She raised her hand and rested it gently on the cool wood, right where Leo's name was engraved in gold letters. Her lips moved in an inaudible whisper. Arthur zoomed in, his heart beating with an unfamiliar force. A single tear traced a path down her cheek before she quickly wiped it away, turned, and disappeared down the hall. He stared at the screen, at the closed door. What was that? Pity. A prayer. In this house, governed by science and sterility, that gesture felt like a forbidden act of faith, a tiny crack in the foundation of his controlled despair. In the days that followed, Arthur found himself strangely distracted. The performance charts of his portfolios, which once held his attention for hours, now seemed dull. The cash flow of his international businesses, the price of gold and dollars, it was all distant background noise. His focus was on the small screens showing life unfold in his silent home. He looked for her, for Elena. He watched her move through the rooms with a grace that contrasted with the mechanical efficiency of the other staff. She didn't clean. She cared. Her hands didn't scrub. They soothed surfaces. He saw her pause to straighten a crooked book on a shelf or to adjust the collar on one of Leo's portraits. They were minuscule gestures, invisible to Mrs. Davison and her team, but to Arthur, watching from his high-tech sanctuary, they were like beacons of light in an oppressive darkness. In the first week, he watched her enter Leo's room. The boy was sitting in his sterile armchair by the window, a tablet on his lap, but his eyes were lost in the unchanging landscape of the perfectly trimmed garden. Elena began to dust the furniture, and as she did, a low, gentle sound filled the room's silence. She was humming, an old lullaby, a simple melody that seemed to weave a tapestry of warmth into the cold, filtered air. Leo lowered his tablet. His large, serious eyes followed her around the room. He said nothing, but for the first time in a very, very long time, there was a spark of curiosity on his face. Arthur felt a tightness in his chest, an emotion that had no name, more valuable than his entire net worth. It was on Friday that the unthinkable happened. Elena finished her cleaning and, before leaving, hesitated for a moment at the door. Then, with a shy smile, she approached Leo. From her canvas bag, she pulled out an object. It was a leather baseball glove, visibly used, bearing the marks of countless court balls and the faint scent of dirt and sun. "This was my son's," she said, her voice as soft as the tune she hummed. "He used to say that good gloves need stories to be truly great. This one has plenty." She held the glove out to Leo. The boy stared at the object as if it were a relic from another world. Slowly, he reached out his pale hand and touched the leather. His fingers traced the worn seams. He looked up at Elena, and then a miracle happened. A genuine, radiant smile lit up his face, a son Arthur hadn't seen in years. He leaned into the screen, his heart racing. At that instant, the bedroom door swung open, and Mrs. Davison entered. Her spine was straighter than usual, her face a mask of frigid disapproval. Her eyes shot from the glove to Eleanor's face. "What is the meaning of this?" Her voice cut through the air like a shard of glass. "You know the protocols. No outside objects are to be brought into this environment, especially something covered in street germs." Eleanor didn't flinch. "It's just a gift, Ma'am." "It's a risk, a contamination," the housekeeper retorted, snatching the glove from Leo's hands with a swift movement. The boy's smile vanished, replaced by a look of shock and fear. "This will be disposed of immediately." Arthur watched it all, paralyzed in his leather chair. He saw his son's joy being stolen, saw Elena's dignity being attacked. His hand trembled as it moved toward the intercom panel on his desk. A single touch would connect him to the room, give voice to his command. But to intervene would be to break the order he himself had established, to undermine the authority of the woman he trusted to protect his son's life. Mrs. Davison turned to leave, the glove held in her hand like toxic waste. Arthur's finger hovered over the button, a millimeter away from changing everything. The silence in the office was deafening, broken only by the low hum of the servers that managed his financial empire. Arthur's finger remained suspended, the skin a hair's breadth from the cool plastic of the intercom button. Every second he hesitated felt like an eternity, a silent debate waged in his soul. One part of him, the logical part that risk-assessed every investment and calculated the return on capital, screamed that Mrs. Davison was right. She was the guardian of the rules, the firewall he had built with his money to protect Leo from the outside world. To intervene would be to undermine the very security structure he had approved and funded. But another part, a part he thought had died with Helen, his father's heart, cried out against the cold cruelty of the scene. He saw the light in his son's eyes being extinguished, saw joy being treated like a disease. With a shaky breath that was the epitome of defeat, Arthur pulled his hand back. It was a coward's retreat, and he knew it. He, who moved markets and swayed the stock exchange with a phone call, felt powerless to protect a simple smile. On the monitors, the scene concluded with brutal finality. Mrs. Davison left, taking the glove and Leo's fleeting happiness with her. The boy shrank into his armchair, his face turned to the window, becoming a porcelain statue once more. Elena remained for another moment. She said nothing. She simply picked up the dust cloth she'd left on a table and, with a slow, deliberate motion, wiped the spot where the glove had been. It was an act of erasing the offense, of restoring dignity to the space. Then she retreated in silence, leaving Leo alone in his glass dome. Arthur shut down the screens. He couldn't bear to see the reflection of his failure anymore. The dark monitor mirrored his face, and he saw a man whose immense wealth was a joke. What was the point of the assets, the trust funds, the legacy he would build for Leo, if the boy couldn't even have the simple memories of a father playing catch with him? That night, he couldn't sleep. The image of his son's desolate face haunted him. He thought of Helen and what she would have done. She would have laughed at Mrs. Davison, grabbed the glove, and taken Leo into the garden, to hell with the protocols. She lived while he merely managed existence. Driven by an impulse he didn't understand, Arthur got up. Barefoot, he walked the dark hallways of his own home, a gilded labyrinth that felt more alien than ever. He didn't go to Leo's room, fearing his presence would only make things worse. Instead, he made his way to the service wing, a territory he normally never entered. The contrast was stark. Persian rugs gave way to cold, functional floors. The art on the walls replaced by control panels and system diagrams. He found what he was looking for, the waste disposal room, where a state-of-the-art incinerator ensured no contaminants ever left the property. Mrs. Davison was meticulous. There would surely be a record. On the control panel, he accessed the day's logs. There it was, 1542, contaminated bio item, leather disposed of. Operator E. Davison. According to the system, the glove should have already been reduced to sterile ash. A feeling of final loss hit him. That was it. The small moment of magic had been erased. Still, something compelled him to check. He entered his master code and opened the incinerator's loading chamber. The stainless steel compartment was cold and immaculately clean, as expected, but it wasn't empty. In the corner, away from the burn mechanism, sat a small object. It wasn't the glove. It was a small, digital voice recorder, a model he gave to his most trusted senior executives. It was on a tiny red light, blinking slowly in the darkness. Before he could process what it meant, the device emitted a soft beep. A message appeared on the small LCD screen, a message that made Arthur's blood run cold. "I know you're watching." The cold air of the disposal room seemed to solidify in Arthur's lungs. The message on the small screen glowed in the dark, each letter a poisoned dart piercing the armor of control he had built around himself. "I know you're watching." It wasn't a threat. It was a statement, a breach. His network of cameras, his all-seeing eye, the tool that gave him a sense of command over the chaos of his life, had been turned into a window through which someone was watching him back. He was the observer observed. With a swift, almost furtive movement, he snatched the recorder. The metal was cool to the touch, but felt like it was burning his hand. He backed out of the room, closing the door with a click that sounded like a gunshot in the dead of night. Back in the lavish corridors of his home, every shadow seemed to writhe. Every portrait on the walls seemed to have living eyes that followed him. The vast fortune he possessed, the assets scattered across the globe, suddenly felt fragile, useless. What good was a net worth that rivaled the treasury of small nations if he couldn't secure the sanctity of his own home? Reaching his office, he locked the door, a gesture that now felt futile. He sat in his chair, the center of his power, and placed the small device on the polished mahogany desk. It was one of his, a state-of-the-art, encrypted model he provided only to his innermost circle of directors. That narrowed the field of suspects, but made the violation even more personal. Mrs. Davison. She was the logical suspect. She had access, perhaps a motive, a show of power, a warning for him not to interfere in her domain. A chill ran down his spine. If she knew he was watching her, then she knew he had seen the scene with the glove. She knew of his hesitation, his weakness. But how? And why leave such a theatrical message? It didn't fit her direct, icy style. With trembling hands, he powered up the monitors, not to check the Tokyo Stock Exchange or the price of Bitcoin, but to begin a hunt within his own walls. He pulled up the security footage from the camera positioned in the service wing hallway, the one with the clearest view of the disposal room door. Its timeline was a meticulous record of every movement. He fast-forwarded, the ghostly bodies of the cleaning staff blurring past. Then he stopped. The time was 10:17 p.m. Long after most of the staff had ended their shifts. The door opened. Arthur leaned forward, his heart hammering against his ribs. He expected to see the tall, austere figure of Mrs. Davison, her hair in its tight bun, her posture rigid. He braced himself for the confirmation of his suspicion, but the person who stepped into the room was not tall nor austere. The figure was smaller, moving with a calm that was both familiar and, now, terrifyingly sinister. He zoomed in, the digital image resolving into sharper pixels. The air left his lungs. It wasn't Mrs. Davison. It was Eleanor. He watched, paralyzed, as she walked to the incinerator compartment, placed the recorder inside, and switched it on. And then, something happened that sent liquid ice spreading through his veins. Before turning to leave, Elena lifted her face and looked directly into the camera lens. It wasn't a casual or accidental glance. It was direct, intentional. It lasted only a second, but in that second, Arthur felt as if she were looking through the lens, through the cables and monitors, directly into his soul. She knew he would be here, reviewing this exact footage. The woman who hummed lullabies, who had a serene gaze and hands that seemed to heal, had just sent him a message, and he had no idea what it meant. Arthur replayed the footage, once, twice, 10 times. Each time the image repeated. The reality grew more bizarre. Elena's look into the camera wasn't one of defiance, nor of malice. There was a calm resolve in her eyes, a depth that completely disarmed him. She wasn't an opponent in one of his complex business deals. She was an enigma wrapped in a simple floral dress. The woman he had begun to see as a beacon of hope had revealed herself to be an intelligence operative of a subtlety that he, a billionaire accustomed to power games, could barely comprehend. His first instinct was that of a cornered CEO. Neutralize the threat, fire her, erase her record, have her sign an NDA so ironclad she couldn't even whisper his family's name. It would be simple, a matter of a phone call to his lawyers. But he knew he couldn't. Firing her would be like burning the only map he had in a dangerous, unknown territory. She knew something, and the way she had acted, quietly, precisely, personally, suggested that what she knew wasn't about his capital or his financial assets. It was about Leo. The possibilities spun in his mind like a crazed carousel. Was she a corporate spy, planted to find a weakness? Unlikely. His son's health was private information, not business leverage. Was it blackmail, perhaps? But what could she want that he wasn't already willing to spend to cure Leo? The cold logic that had made him a billionaire failed to find a pattern, to calculate the motive. Her serenity didn't fit with greed, and the tenderness he'd seen in her eyes when she looked at his son didn't match the cruelty of a blackmailer. There was only one option left: to play her game. He waited until the next morning. The household routine proceeded with its usual precision. Mrs. Davison supervised breakfast, the air was purified, the air quality reports were delivered to his tablet. Everything was normal, except that Arthur's world was upside down. He summoned Elena to his office, not through Mrs. Davison, but directly, using the internal communication system, a small act of rebellion he knew would be noted. She entered a few minutes later without the slightest hesitation. She wore the same simple uniform, her hair in a loose bun. She stopped at a respectful distance from his desk, hands clasped in front of her, her gaze calm and direct. Arthur slid the small recorder across the polished surface of the desk. The sound was the only thing that broke the silence. "You left this for me," he said, his voice more controlled than he felt. Elena glanced at the device, then back at him. "Yes, sir," she replied, without pretense. "I thought it would be the quietest way to have a conversation." Her audacity startled him. A conversation about what? If you have a complaint, there are proper channels. "Some things are too important for channels, Mr. Sterling," she said, and for the first time he noticed a steel-like strength beneath the softness of her voice. "This isn't about my job. It's about your son." Arthur felt a chill. "What do you know about my son?" Elena took a step forward, a breach of protocol that made Arthur's muscles tense. "I know what you know, that he's sick. But perhaps I see things that you, being so close, can no longer see." "And what do you see?" he asked, in his voice a harsh whisper. She looked past him at the glass walls of the office, at the sterile garden beyond. "I see a cage, a beautiful, expensive, gilded cage, and I see that the very bars of that cage, the things you bought to protect him, might be the source of his suffering." The accusation was so shocking, so direct, that Arthur was speechless. He was about to retort, to unleash the fury simmering beneath his surface, when a sharp, piercing sound sliced through the office. A shrill alarm he knew all too well. The medical alert from Leo's room. The sound that always preceded hell. The shriek of the alarm tore through the office's manufactured calm. An electronic scream that obliterated all thought. Arthur's blood ran cold. The quiet showdown with Elena, the shocking revelation, it all dissolved into a primal instinct of panic. He didn't look at her. There was no time. He shot out of the room, running down hallways that suddenly seemed miles long. Every footfall was a hammer of terror in his chest. All his money, all his power, was utterly useless against that high-pitched sound that announced his son's fight for life. The door to Leo's room was open. The scene was controlled chaos. Two nurses moved with swift efficiency around the bed. Mrs. Davison, her face pale and taut, held a nebulizer mask over Leo's face, her voice issuing clipped, precise orders. Monitors beeped in a frantic rhythm, displaying alarming red numbers. And at the center of it all was his son. Leo's small body was convulsing, his shoulders heaving with each desperate attempt to draw in air. His lips had a terrifying bluish tint, and his eyes, wide with panic, found Arthur's. It was a pleading look that shattered Arthur's heart into a million pieces. He was a powerful billionaire, but here, in this room, he was just a helpless father watching his child suffocate. One of the doctors from Zurich appeared on a wall-mounted screen, his image crisp, his voice distant. Increase the oxygen flow. Administer the emergency epinephrine injection. They were the same orders as always, the same futile dance of expensive science against an invisible enemy. They had done all this before, and it wasn't working. Leo's breathing grew louder, a sharp wheeze that was the sound of Arthur's failure. It was then that he sensed her, a calm presence at the doorway. Eleanor was standing there, her hands clasped in front of her, her face a mask of profound compassion. She wasn't looking at the machines or the doctors on the screen. Her eyes were fixed on Leo. Mrs. Davison noticed her. "Get out of here," she hissed, without taking her eyes off Leo. "This is a sterile environment. Your presence is a contamination." But Eleanor didn't move. Her eyes met Arthur's over the chaos, and in that gaze, he saw not a cleaner or a mysterious blackmailer. He saw the same calm, the same steel-like strength he'd seen in his office. And he remembered her words. The things you bought to protect him might be the source of his suffering. Desperation. It was an ocean, and he was drowning. He would grab at any lifeline, no matter how fragile. "Let her stay," Arthur said, his voice raw, surprising everyone, including himself. Mrs. Davison looked at him, stunned. "Sir, the protocols?" "To hell with the protocols," he exploded, his control finally shattering. "They're not working." He turned to Elena, the look of a broken man. You said you see things. What do you see? For God's sake, help me." Elena didn't hesitate. She walked into the room, ignoring the housekeeper's furious glare. "He's inflamed. The air he's breathing is attacking him," she said, her voice low but clear. "We need to calm him from the inside. May I make him a tea?" A tea. The suggestion was so absurd, so ridiculously simple amidst the high-tech paraphernalia, that it bordered on madness. Mrs. Davison let out a disbelieving, bitter laugh. "A tea? The boy is suffocating, and you suggest a hot beverage." But Arthur was looking at his son's face, at the undiminished panic. He had nothing left to lose. "Go," he ordered Elena. "Quickly." Without another word, she turned and left. The next few minutes were the longest of Arthur's life. Elena returned with a steaming mug that gave off an earthy, floral scent of chamomile and herbs. Mrs. Davison tried to intercept her. "I forbid this. It hasn't been tested. We don't know what's in it." Arthur stepped between them. He took the mug from Elena's hands, the warmth spreading through his own cold fingers. "I'll take responsibility," he said. With a nurse's help, he lifted Leo's head and brought the mug to his bluish lips. "Drink, son. Just a sip." Leo, in his panic, obeyed. He swallowed the warm liquid, and then another sip, and then something miraculous happened. The desperate heaving of his body subsided. The sharp wheeze in his lungs seemed to soften, losing its cutting edge. His breathing didn't become perfect, but it calmed, shifting from a violent battle to a gentler struggle. The terror in his eyes began to recede, replaced by a profound exhaustion. The numbers on the monitors started to stabilize. Slowly, the red of danger gave way to the yellow of caution. Leo's eyes fluttered closed, exhaustion finally winning. And for the first time that night, he took a breath without the sound of death rattling in it. The silence that followed in the room was deeper than any silence that house had ever known. Arthur stared at the empty mug in his hand, and then at his son, now sleeping. The empire he had built was dust. The only thing that mattered was the gentle steam still rising from the simple ceramic, a silent testament that he had just gambled his son's life on a cleaner's herbal tea, and won. Dawn found Arthur not in his luxurious bed, but in an uncomfortable armchair beside Leo's. The grey morning light seeped through the hermetically sealed blinds, casting stripes across the now silent medical equipment. The only sound was the soft, steady rhythm of his son's breathing. It was the most precious melody in the world, a symphony worth more than all the dividends from his stock portfolio. He hadn't slept a wink. The night had been a long vigil, a pendulum swinging between profound relief and utter confusion. Every time he looked at Leo's peaceful face, a wave of gratitude washed over him. But when he thought about how that peace had been achieved, the logic of his world fell apart. A tea, a simple herbal tea, had accomplished what a team of the world's top specialists, backed by millions of dollars in technology, could not. Mrs. Davison had been dismissed with a curt gesture the night before, her face a mask of indignation and defeat. The nurses remained, but they were now just quiet observers. The real power in that room, Arthur realized, came not from wires and tubes, but from something much older and more inexplicable. He needed answers. He stood up, his joints protesting the long night, and went to find Elena. He found her in the main kitchen, the morning sun illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. She wasn't cleaning. She was sitting at the large wooden table, a mug of tea identical to the one that had saved his son cupped in her hands. She looked up as he entered, and there was no triumph in her eyes, only a tired serenity. "How is he?" she asked. "Sleeping," Arthur replied, his voice hoarse. "Breathing." He sat in the chair opposite her, the enormous table that had hosted banquets for moguls and politicians, now feeling like an intimate, confessional space. "What was in that tea?" Elena took a sip before answering. "Things from my grandmother's garden. Ginger for the inflammation. Chamomile and lemon balm to calm the nerves and the spasms. A little thyme to open the lungs. Garden herbs," Arthur repeated, the words sounding foreign in his own mouth. "How did you know?" "I'm not a doctor, Mr. Sterling," she said, looking directly at him. "But I am a mother, and I'm the granddaughter of a woman who couldn't afford doctors, so she learned to listen to the earth. Some things aren't about curing the disease, but about restoring balance. Your son's body is at war with the air he breathes. The tea didn't cure him, it just gave him a truce." Her simple, profound words resonated with him. "The cage," he whispered, remembering their conversation in his office. "You said the bars might be the problem. I have no proof, only what my eyes see and my heart feels," Elena said. "This house, it doesn't breathe. It's too clean, too quiet. There's no life in it. You built a fortress against the world to protect your son, but maybe you created a prison that is suffocating him with its very protection." The truth in those words was a sharp knife. He, who prided himself on his analytical ability, on identifying liabilities and assets in any business, had never looked at his own home that way. The expensive air purifiers, the sterilization protocols, the absence of dust, could they be the enemy disguised as a protector? Driven by a new urgency, a need to see for himself, he made a decision that went against all his instincts. "I need to know," he said, more to himself than to her. He picked up his tablet, his fingers flying across the screen. He wasn't accessing the stock exchange or the crypto market. He was contacting a specialized firm, one that operated in the shadows of corporate espionage but offered a unique service: discreet forensic environmental analysis. He ordered their most expensive, most urgent package: laboratory-grade air quality sensors as small as a dime, capable of detecting the most minute particles of volatile organic compounds, toxins, and allergens. They would be installed secretly in every room, disguised as screwheads or outlet covers. It was a negligible investment for him, but one that could yield the most important return of his life: the truth. "No one can know about this," he said to Elena, making her his co-conspirator, especially Mrs. Davison. A silent understanding passed between them. They were now an unlikely alliance, a billionaire and a cleaner, united by a common purpose. That night, while Leo still slept peacefully, a team of technicians as silent as ghosts moved through the mansion, installing the tiny electronic eyes and noses that would become Arthur's spies. By dawn, the house was quiet again, but it was now filled with secrets. Arthur sat in his office, the monitors displaying not stock charts, but the raw data beginning to stream from the sensors. Everything looked normal, the air purity levels near perfect, just as Mrs. Davison's reports always indicated. He began to wonder if he'd made a terrible mistake, if his desperate faith in Elena was just that, desperation. Then something changed. He watched, transfixed, as the graph from the sensor in Leo's room began to spike. A red line, indicating an unidentified chemical compound, began to climb dangerously, and he realized what was happening. The spike coincided exactly with the moment the room's air purification system, programmed for its 6 a.m. high-power cleaning cycle, kicked in. The cure he had bought with his fortune, the technology in which he had placed all his faith, was, at that very moment, pumping his son's room full of an invisible poison. The red line on the monitor wasn't just data, it was a digital serpent, a chart of betrayal. Arthur stared at the screen, his brain refusing to process the magnitude of what he was seeing. The hum of the servers managing his billion-dollar estate seemed to mock him. He was a master at analyzing markets, at predicting the cash flow of nations, yet he had been blind to the poison circulating in his own home. Every asthma attack, every night of panic, every one of his son's tears. He hadn't just been failing to prevent them, he had been causing them. The single largest health investment he had ever made was, in fact, a slow, daily assault on Leo's fragile respiratory system. Guilt hit him with the force of a tidal wave, a cold, dark surge that threatened to drown him. He remembered the pride he'd felt signing the contract for that purification system, believing he was buying the purest air on the planet. Instead, he'd bought a weapon. The revelation reframed everything. Mrs. Davison, the efficient and loyal administrator, the guardian of his home. She was the direct supervisor of all household systems. She was either complicit or incompetently blind. Neither option was acceptable. Anger began to bubble beneath the guilt, a cold and focused fury. He needed more information before he acted. With a surgeon's precision, he began combing through his digital files, searching for the maintenance and supply contracts for the purification system. The paperwork was immaculate, detailed, and always approved by Mrs. Davison. He found the name of the company responsible for the replacement filters, Pure Air Solutions. A generic, innocuous name, but something bothered him. The company was relatively new, yet it held a multi-million-dollar exclusive contract with his estate. He ran a quick, discreet corporate record search, using the deep-dive research tools he normally reserved for business acquisitions. What he discovered made his stomach turn. The owner of Pure Air Solutions was a man named Robert Davison, Mrs. Davison's brother. The connection was undeniable, the implication hideous. Her greed, a handsome kickback on every fraudulent filter, was suffocating his son. Feeling nauseous, he stood and went to find Elena. He found her in the solarium, polishing the leaves of a fiddle-leaf fig. The sunlight enveloped her, making her seem like the only pure thing in his contaminated house. "You were right," he said, his voice low. "The problem is coming from inside, from something I installed." She stopped her work and looked at him with her calm eyes. There was no surprise on her face, only a sad confirmation. "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to rip the evil out by the root," he replied, his voice hardening with determination. But before he could say more, Mrs. Davison's sharp voice echoed through the solarium. "Mr. Sterling!" She was marching toward them, her face a mask of controlled fury. In her outstretched hand, she held a small plastic evidence bag. Inside was a sapphire and diamond brooch. Arthur recognized it immediately. It had belonged to Helen. "This," the housekeeper said, her voice trembling with feigned indignation, "was found in Mrs. Garcia's locker, at the bottom of her purse." She turned to Eleanor, her eyes flashing. "I knew you were untrustworthy from the moment you set foot in here. A thief." Elena looked at the brooch and then at Mrs. Davison, her face pale but her posture steady. She said nothing. The setup was perfect, the accusation devastating. Arthur felt the floor disappear from under him. He had the truth on his monitors, a truth of poison and betrayal. But Mrs. Davison had an accusation of theft, a tangible crime, with proof in her hand. The housekeeper faced him, a barely concealed smirk of triumph on her lips. "Well, sir, what do you intend to do about the thief you insisted on defending?" The solarium, which moments before had felt like a sanctuary of light, had become a courtroom. Helen's brooch glittered inside the plastic bag, a cold star casting shadows of doubt and accusation. Arthur looked from the brooch to Elena's impassive face, and then to the barely contained triumph in Mrs. Davison's eyes. He was at a crossroads. He knew, with a certainty that transcended any physical proof, that Elena was innocent. The woman who had made an herbal tea in the middle of the night out of pure compassion was not a thief. But Mrs. Davison had orchestrated the scene with diabolical precision. Calling the police would create a scandal. His word, the word of a billionaire, against that of a cleaner would be the final ruling, but it would leave scars. More importantly, it would reveal his hand. Before he had all the pieces, he needed time. He needed to protect Elena without giving away his own investigation. "Mrs. Davison," Arthur began, his voice dangerously calm, "leave the brooch on my desk. I will handle this matter personally." The housekeeper hesitated, the victory in her expression giving way to a slight uncertainty. She had expected an explosion, a summary dismissal, the validation of her authority. His calm threw her off balance. "But, sir, the procedures—" "I said I will handle it," Arthur cut in, the steel in his tone leaving no room for argument. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have more pressing matters to attend to. Check on Mr. Leo's condition and send me a report in 1 hour." The mention of Leo was a tactical blow. It shifted the focus and reminded her of her primary responsibilities, or at least the ones she pretended to have. Reluctantly, she placed the bag on a nearby table and retreated, her spine rigid with indignation. The silence she left behind was heavy. "She planted it," Eleanor said, finally breaking the quiet. "It wasn't a question." "I know," Arthur replied. He moved closer to her. "She's desperate. She feels her control slipping, and she's right." He looked at her hands, the hands that had soothed his son. "I need you to trust me. Do you trust me?" Elena met his gaze for a long moment, her eyes searching. Then she gave a slow nod. "I trust Leo's father." The simplicity of that answer hit him harder than any oath of loyalty. She didn't trust the billionaire, the empire owner. She trusted the man he was trying to become. Over the next few hours, Arthur worked with a speed and focus he hadn't used since building his first fortune. He didn't fire Mrs. Davison. Instead, he isolated her with bureaucracy. He requested detailed reports on every household expenditure for the past 5 years, every hire, every service order. He buried her in impossible work, keeping her occupied and away from his operations. While she was trapped in her office, he acted first. He shut down the air purification system throughout the entire house, citing an emergency maintenance issue he had fabricated himself. The ensuing silence was strange, as if the house itself had held its breath. Next, he found Elena. Together, they went to Leo's room. The boy was awake, reading a book, his breathing noticeably easier even without the machine's constant hum. "Leo," Arthur said, kneeling beside his son's bed, a gesture he hadn't made in years. We're going to try something different. We're going to let some real air in." With Elena's help, he unsealed the windows. For the first time in years, the afternoon breeze drifted into the room, carrying with it the scent of cut grass and damp earth. Leo breathed it in, his eyes widening in surprise as if he were tasting air for the first time. He didn't cough, he didn't wheeze. He smiled. That afternoon, father and son stood together by the open window, watching a butterfly dance over the flowers in the garden. Elena stood back, a quiet, reassuring presence. Arthur felt a connection to his son he thought he had lost forever. The absence of the machine's hum was filled by the soft sound of the wind and Leo's occasional laugh. But the peace was fragile, and Arthur knew it. That night, he was in his office, reviewing the data streams from the sensors, now that the purification system was off. The toxin levels had plummeted to nearly zero. It was the final proof, the weapon he needed. Suddenly, his security monitor flashed with an alert. An external camera near the service gate. He enlarged the image. It was Mrs. Davison. She was leaving the property, but she wasn't alone. She was handing a briefcase to a man in a car. Arthur zoomed in on the man's face. It wasn't her brother. It was Victor Morrison, his biggest business rival, a man known for his ruthlessness and unethical tactics. Arthur felt his blood run cold. This was no longer about fraudulent filters and kickbacks. His housekeeper wasn't just poisoning his son for greed. She was selling information about his life, his family, his greatest vulnerability to his enemy. The betrayal was deeper and more dangerous than he had ever imagined. The image on the monitor froze, but the scene kept replaying in Arthur's mind. A poisonous loop of treachery. Victor Morrison. The name echoed in his head, recontextualizing everything. The subtle attacks on his businesses over the last few months, the attempts to undermine his stock values, the pressure on his international investments. He had thought it was just the vicious game of high-stakes business. Now he saw the truth. Morrison wasn't attacking his capital. He was attacking his foundation. He had found his greatest vulnerability, his deepest liability, his love for his son, and Mrs. Davison had been the key, the traitor who opened the gates. A cold, precise fury, far more dangerous than hot anger, settled over Arthur. He felt like a fool, while he had been counting his profits and dividends, worrying about the price of the euro and gold. The enemy wasn't on the stock exchange floor, but in his own kitchen, serving him coffee. He didn't confront her, not right away. Firing misses. Davison would be like cutting the head off a hydra, only to have two more grow in its place. She was a symptom, not the disease. The real target was Morrison. And to get to Morrison, he needed Davison to think she was still in control. The next morning, he called Elena to his office. When she entered, he was standing, looking out at the garden. He didn't ask her to sit in one of the guest chairs. Instead, he gestured to the chair beside his own, in front of the bank of monitors. "Sit down," he said. "There's something you need to see." The gesture broke the last invisible barrier between them. She was no longer an employee being called to the boss's office. She was a partner in a war council. He showed her the recording, the exchange of the briefcase, the face of Morrison in the car. Elena watched in silence, her serene face hardening into an expression of grave understanding. When the video ended, she didn't comment on the corporate espionage or the business betrayal. Her first question was, does this mean Leo's sickness was intentional? "I don't know," Arthur admitted, the uncertainty gnawing at him. "I don't know if it was a plan to destabilize me, or if Davison just exploited the situation for profit and ran to my enemy when she felt threatened. Either way, the result is the same. My son paid the price for her greed and my blindness." "What will you do?" she asked, her voice steady. "I'm going to give them back what they gave me. Poison," Arthur said, "but mine will be financial. I'm going to dismantle Morrison's empire, piece by piece. But to do that, I need peace at home. I need Leo to be safe and happy, and I need your help." That morning, Arthur took a step that, for him, was bolder than any hostile takeover. holding Leo's hand. With Eleanor at his side, he walked out the back door and stepped onto the soft grass of the garden. Leo hesitated, his foot hovering over the threshold as if he were about to step into unknown waters. He looked up at his father, seeking permission. "It's okay, son," Arthur said, his voice thick with emotion. "The sun is good for you." For the first time in years, Leo felt grass under his shoes. He took a step, then another, his face lifted to the warmth of the sun. Elena smiled and discreetly handed Arthur an object he hadn't seen since that fateful day, the leather baseball glove. She had rescued it from the incinerator before Mrs. Davison could destroy it. With his heart in his throat, Arthur held the glove out to his son. Leo took it, his fingers sliding over the worn leather, and a slow, wondrous smile spread across his face. He looked at his father, his eyes shining. "Will you play catch with me?" he asked. And there, on the lawn of his mansion-turned-prison, the billionaire Arthur Sterling, whose hands moved millions of dollars around the globe, played catch with his son for the very first time. The sound of Leo's laughter, clear and wheeze-free, echoing in the fresh air, was the greatest return on investment he had ever received. Later, he called a meeting of the entire household staff. Mrs. Davison stood at the front, expecting to reassert her authority. Arthur stood before them all, with Eleanor quietly at his side. "Starting today, there are new rules," he announced, his voice resonating with unquestionable power. "The windows in this house will remain open whenever the weather allows. Chemical cleaning products will be replaced with natural alternatives, and my son's health and happiness will no longer be dictated by machines, but by common sense and care." "Mrs. Garcia," he said, gesturing to Eleanor, "it will be helping me oversee this transition." A murmur went through the staff. Mrs. Davison went white as a sheet, her lips pressed into a thin line. She hadn't just been publicly overruled, she had been replaced in her own domain. Arthur met her gaze, his eyes cold. The game had begun, and he had just made his first move. The house changed. It was subtle at first, like a slowly rising tide. The sterile silence was replaced by the whisper of wind in the curtains and the distant sound of birdsong. The antiseptic smell gave way to the scent of lemon and lavender from the natural cleaners Elena prepared. For most of the staff, it was a welcome change, a reprieve from an oppressive regime. But for Mrs. Davison, every open window, every laugh from Leo echoing in the garden, was an affront, a dismantling of her power. She watched Elena move through the house, no longer as a cleaner, but as a trusted advisor, and the poison of envy and fear ate away at her. Arthur, meanwhile, was fighting his war on two fronts. By day, he was a present father. He taught Leo how to throw a curveball, rediscovering muscles he hadn't used in years and, more importantly, relearning the language of fatherhood. They had picnics in the garden, lying on the grass and finding shapes in the clouds. Every easy breath Leo took was a victory, every smile a dividend of pure joy that replenished Arthur's soul. By night, he became the financial predator the business world knew and feared. Armed with the knowledge that Morrison was watching him, he turned the tables. He began to plant false information, breadcrumbs leading his rival's spies down dead ends, causing him to waste capital on fruitless ventures. Simultaneously, Arthur launched a quiet, relentless assault on the true heart of Morrison's empire, his stock portfolio. He used his vast fortune to subtly manipulate the market, selling off large blocks of shares through shell corporations to create panic, then buying them back at lower prices through other entities, eroding Morrison's net worth without him ever seeing where the attack was coming from. Elena became his unlikely confidant. In the long evenings after Leo was asleep, they would sit in the kitchen, the one place in the house that now felt truly like a home. She told him about her life, about the son she had raised on her own, about losing her parents, and the resilience she had learned from hardship. She didn't understand the intricacies of cash flow or stock options, but she understood the human soul. "You are fighting with his weapons," she said one night, watching the strain on Arthur's face. "The anger, the revenge, that is his world. Do not lose yourself in it." Her words struck him. He was so focused on destroying Morrison that he was in danger of becoming like him, a man driven by darkness. "What should I do?" he asked, the question stripped of all arrogance. "Let him destroy himself." "Justice doesn't work that way in my world," Arthur replied bitterly. "Then maybe it's time to change your world," she said softly. Mrs. Davison, feeling the net closing in, made a mistake. Desperate to prove her worth to Morrison, or perhaps to protect herself, she tried to access Arthur's private servers, looking for more substantial information to sell. What she didn't know was that Arthur, anticipating such a move, had set a digital trap. The moment she entered her password, a silent alarm tripped on Arthur's computer, and every keystroke, every file she tried to open, was logged. She found nothing of value, only the false financial reports he had planted. But she left behind what he needed, irrefutable proof of corporate espionage, a federal crime. The climax didn't come with a bang, but with a quiet click. Arthur copied the logs of her hacking attempt. He now had everything: the filter fraud, the connection to her brother, the conspiracy with Victor Morrison, the framed theft, and now the espionage. He could crush them, her and Morrison, with the full weight of the law and financial ruin. He picked up the phone to call his head of security, the man who would start the process that would lead to their arrest. His hand hovered over the keypad. He glanced out his office window at the moonlit garden, and he saw it. Leo had left the baseball glove on the grass. Next to it lay the ball, a perfect pair, waiting for tomorrow's game. And he heard Elena's voice in his head. "Do not lose yourself in it." He put the phone down. There was another way, a better way. He called a meeting for the next morning in his office, not with his lawyers, but with Mrs. Davison and, to her surprise, her brother, Robert. And on a video conference he forced Victor Morrison to accept, under threat of leaking damning information to the press. He gathered all his enemies. He didn't yell. He didn't accuse. With a deadly calm, he laid out the evidence, one piece at a time. The air sensor data, the bank transfers to Robert's company, the recordings of her meeting Morrison's man, the logs of her attempt to hack his servers. The silence in the room and on the screen was absolute. Mrs. Davison crumbled, her pale face dissolving into silent tears of defeat. Morrison, on the screen, looked as if he'd aged 10 years. Arthur had them, completely. "I could destroy you," he said, his voice low but carrying immense weight. "I could make sure you never work in this country again. I could send you to prison. And every part of me wants to." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "But my son is outside, learning to play baseball, and he's teaching me how to be a better man. So, this is what we're going to do. You are all going to disappear. You will sell your companies, liquidate your assets, and donate a significant portion of your profits to a pediatric asthma research fund I am creating. And you will never cross my path or my family's path again. In return, I give you silence." He stood, ending the meeting. The takedown wasn't the climax, it was a deliberate anticlimax. The true victory wasn't in their punishment, but in his own freedom from the cycle of revenge. As he walked out of the office, leaving them to contemplate the wreckage of their lives, he felt a weight lift from his shoulders. He was no longer a prisoner of that war, he was free. And as he walked toward the garden, he knew he wasn't heading to a business deal, but to something infinitely more valuable, a game of catch with his son. Arthur didn't look back. He left the wreckage of 3 shattered lives in his office, closing the door not with a slam of victory, but with the soft click of finality. He didn't feel the triumph he had imagined. Their ruin brought him no joy, only a grey emptiness. the ashen taste of a battle that should never have been fought. The real victory wasn't in that room, with its ghosts of greed and betrayal. It was outside, under the sun, where the future was waiting for him. He found Leo in the garden, the leather glove already on his hand, his eyes bright with anticipation. Elena was sitting on a nearby bench, watching with a serene smile. She wasn't an employee supervising. She was a guardian of this sacred moment. Arthur took off his suit jacket, loosened his tie, and rolled up his sleeves. They were the gestures of a man shedding armor he had worn for far too long. He picked up the ball. The rough leather against his palm felt more real than any billion-dollar contract. He threw. The first pitch was clumsy, too high. Leo laughed, a pure, crystal sound that filled the air. "Lower, Dad!" The word Dad, spoken so naturally, so joyfully, hit Arthur with the force of a revelation. He wasn't the CEO, the investor, the billionaire, here, on this lawn. He was just Dad. They played for over an hour. They ran, they laughed, they tumbled onto the grass. Arthur dove for a ball, staining his designer trousers with dirt, and felt a happiness so intense it almost hurt. Leo's laughter was the only metric that mattered, the only profit he craved. The sound of that joy was true wealth, a net worth no stock market could ever measure. In the distance, he saw Eleanor, a calm presence that made all of this possible. She was the one who had given him his son back. She was the one who had opened the windows, not just of the house, but of his soul. Night fell, bringing a blanket of stars and a peaceful silence. Leo was asleep in his room, his breathing deep and even. The window cracked open to let in the scent of garden jasmine. The house was no longer a sterile museum, it was a home. Arthur found Elena in the garden, in the same spot where he had played catch with Leo. She was looking up at the sky, the moonlight silvering her hair. "Thank you," he said, coming to stand beside her. The words felt small, inadequate for the immensity of his gratitude. "I didn't do anything," she replied. "You just allowed yourself to be a father." "I didn't know how," he admitted, the confession a raw whisper. "When Helen was gone, a part of me went with her. I hid behind work, behind numbers and money. I thought if I built the walls high enough, if I sterilized the world, I could protect Leo from pain. But I only imprisoned him, and I imprisoned myself." He took a deep breath, the night air filling his lungs. "I was sicker than he was. A lonely man, afraid to feel anything. You didn't come into my life to clean the dust, Elena. You came to clean my soul." She turned to him, her eyes shining in the dark. "We all have our losses, Mr. Sterling. I lost my parents young, raised my son on the stories they told me, and a strength I didn't know I had. Grief doesn't have to be a prison. It can be the soil where resilience grows." In that moment, under the stars, the chasm between their worlds vanished. He was not the billionaire boss. She was not the cleaner. They were two souls who had known darkness and found solace in each other's vulnerability. He wanted to say more, wanted to say everything. He wanted to ask her to stay, not as an employee, but as the anchor of his new life. The words formed in his mind, but before he could speak them, he needed to know one thing. He needed to see her, not as the savior of his family, but as the woman she was. "Elena," he said, his voice soft, "I never asked, what is your dream?" Arthur's question hung in the fragrant night air, an offering of intimacy that Elena accepted with the same serene grace she accepted everything in life. She didn't look down or show a trace of shyness. Instead, her gaze remained on his, the moonlight reflected in her dark eyes. "My dream," she repeated softly, testing the weight of the word. "I think my dreams have always been too small for a world like yours, Mr. Sterling. Call me Arthur," he corrected her gently, "and no dream is small." She smiled, a smile that lit the shadows. "Well, Arthur, my dream was to see my son grow into a good man, and he did. Now, I dream of a piece of land, a garden, not a perfectly manicured one like this, but a place that's a little wild, filled with herbs that heal and vegetables that feed. A place where people from my community could come to find some peace, to learn about the plants, and to take home a little health. A place to get your hands dirty with soil and clean your soul. The simplicity of that wish struck him with physical force. He, who dreamed of conquering markets, of growing his net worth, of building an empire of impersonal assets, had never conceived of a dream so fundamentally good. All his fortune, all his money suddenly seemed pale and lifeless compared to the richness contained in that simple garden. He realized with a painful clarity that he had spent his entire life accumulating resources and had never once thought to cultivate life. "That's not a small dream, Elena," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "It's the biggest dream of all." He took a step forward, closing the last of the physical distance between them. "I've spent the last few weeks watching you bring life back to this house, to my son, to me. You've shown me what real wealth is, and it has nothing to do with what's on my bank statements. I don't want to live in a sterile museum anymore. I want to live in a home. I want to have a garden." He paused, his heart hammering against his ribs. "I know the gulf between our worlds is vast, but I don't want you to be my employee. I can't be your boss anymore. I've already fired the housekeeper, the doctors from Zurich, and the army of specialists, but I have one last firing to do. Elena Garcia, I'm firing you from your position as my cleaner." Her eyes widened in surprise, a flicker of uncertainty crossing her face. He hurried on, his hand reaching out to touch hers, a hesitant but meaningful touch. "And I'm hiring you, if you'll accept, for a new position. No salary, but with all the dividends life can offer. I'm hiring you to be my partner, to help me cultivate this home, to care for our boy, and maybe to help me build a certain garden." Eleanor looked down at his hand on hers, then up at his face, at the eyes that no longer held the coldness of a billionaire, but the vulnerability of a man. She saw the truth there, the sincerity of a soul wiped clean. Silent tears welled and rolled down her cheeks, but she was smiling. "I accept the position," she whispered. The next morning, the house awoke to a sound that had never before echoed in its halls. Leo was on the phone in the living room, the garden door wide open, his voice filled with an infectious excitement. "Yeah, tomorrow afternoon. Bring your glove, and tell Marcus to bring his too. My dad's going to teach us how to throw a curveball." Arthur, standing at the top of the stairs with Elena by his side, listened and felt his heart overflow. The conflicts were over. The war was won. His empire was no longer made of stocks and capital. It was made of the sound of his son's laughter, the warmth of Elena's hand in his, and the promise of a future bursting with life. Weeks later, the Sterling mansion was unrecognizable, not in its structure, but in its soul. Where the oppressive silence of a museum once reigned, now floated the sound of children's laughter. Where the air was once a sterile chemical compound, now danced the golden dust of sunlight. Carrying the scent of freshly cut grass and the apple cake Elena was baking in the kitchen, the windows, once sealed like a spaceship's, remained open, and the house finally breathed in unison with the world outside. Arthur, the billionaire who once commanded his empire from a sanctuary of glass and steel, now spent his afternoons in a wicker chair on the veranda. His monitors were dark. The fluctuations of the stock market and the price of Bitcoin no longer held his attention. His entire focus, his entire vast interest, was centered on the garden. Leo, his son, who less than a month ago was a prisoner in his own room, was now the center of a loud and joyful universe. With 3 friends from the neighborhood, he was in the middle of a boisterous baseball game. The lawn, once an untouched ornamental carpet, was scarred with the tracks of their running and sliding. The thwack of the leather ball hitting a glove was the new music of the house. Leo ran for third base, his face flushed with exertion and joy, his hair tousled by the wind. He didn't cough. His breath was the strong, steady rush of health. Every run, every shout of celebration was a testament to the miraculous cure that hadn't come from expensive technology, but from the simple wisdom of letting life in. Arthur watched, and in his chest, a sense of peace so deep and vast settled that he felt he could float away on it. He thought of the man he used to be, a financial titan, a hoarder of wealth, a man whose net worth was measured in billions but whose emotional life was bankrupt. That man would have seen this game as an interruption, a noisy distraction from more important business. The man he was now knew there was no more important business in the world than this. Elena came out of the kitchen, wiping her hands on an apron, and stood beside his chair. She handed him a glass of fresh lemonade. The brush of her fingers against his was gentle, familiar, a quiet comfort that had become the anchor of his world. He held her hand a moment longer. "Look at them," Arthur whispered. "Look at him." "I see," she replied, a smile in her voice. "I see a happy boy. And I see a good father." Her words were the highest praise he had ever received, more valuable than any business award or magazine headline. He, the man who thought he could buy everything, had discovered the one thing money couldn't buy and that he needed most: happiness. He hadn't just healed his son, he had found himself. Elena's community garden project was well underway. Arthur didn't just write a check, he got involved. He used his business acumen to secure the land, to organize the logistics, to turn her dream into a sustainable reality. He discovered that using his capital